It is the Awesemo MLB Strategy Show. A little bit of an unexpected layoff. Not that we weren't expected to be off because of the All-Star break, but yesterday there was a one-game slate, and I found out right before the show was about to start that it got canceled because the game got canceled. I was sitting in my room playing video games, and my brother had asked me, "Hey, aren't you doing? Is your baseball show still happening?" Because the Yankees game got postponed. I had no clue. That was how I found out. But anyway, we're back from a little bit of a hiatus. Adam and I doing the MLB Strategy Show again. But a little bit of a wrinkle here because like half the games, we don't know the starting pitchers yet. But Adam, what's going on with you?
Hey, yeah, nice brag about, getting yesterday off. I didn't. I still did my morning show and then the game got canceled. But yeah, excited to be back to a full slate, not having to talk about single game slates, but also just because I clearly enjoy playing full slates more. So excited to be back to it. Hopefully maybe we'll get some starting pitcher news during the show because right now we have quite a few teams that don't know who they're pitching. But either way, excited to be back, excited to be talking about a full baseball slate.
Yeah, so as of now, the teams that we do not know a starting pitcher for, and by the way, it is a 14-game slate, one of them a doubleheader, so 13-game slate on FanDuel, but 14-game slate on DraftKings pending no games get canceled due to COVID or weather or anything like that. But as of now, the Detroit Tigers playing on the tail end of a back-to-back tonight against the Twins. No starting pitcher for the Tigers. The Yankees, no starting pitcher against the Red Sox. For the Pittsburgh Pirates today, no official starting pitcher against the Mets. The White Sox, no official starting pitcher against the Astros. The Royals, no starting pitcher against the Orioles. And then we have the St. Louis Cardinals with no starting pitcher tonight against the Giants. Adam seems like he might be dying. So I'll do the ad read right now. Let Adam compose himself for a second.
No, I'm good. I tried to hold it in. It didn't work and it made it worse.
Either way, listen, I was planning on doing the ad read now anyway, but now I'll just do it. I'll give you another second to compose yourself. But today's show is sponsored by PrizePicks. Guys, if you are new to PrizePicks, head on over to PrizePicks.com. Use the promo code Awesemo, and you can get up to a $100 bonus on your first deposit. Now, one thing that's really cool about PrizePicks is if you guys are well-versed in a multitude of different sports, they have everything up here. There is CSGO, which I'm not exactly sure what that stands for, but I'm just looking at some plays. You could pick Zort to have over or under 18.5 kills. You go over to Call of Duty, and you could have a Schultzy for over under 75 fantasy points. Then we have MLB, we've got NBA player props. But definitely there's somebody who's into all these different sports. There's I didn't even know highlight existed outside of like when I go to casinos in Florida, but there's highlight props up here. So PrizePicks is everything. Use the promo code Awesemo and get up to a $100 bonus on the first deposit you put there. So let's start talking about some of this baseball slate. And the other thing too is that some of the data that we're talking about, it's just going to end up moving throughout the day because we look at the top pitchers tool and the top stacks tool. And, as we get better information about who is going to be starting for some of these teams, it's obviously going to move around odds of players being individual top pitchers. Also the top pitchers tool that is going to be free today. So you can go check that out and you can refresh it as we get more information. And then top stacks also, as we find out which pitchers are actually pitching, that is going to sway which team's odds of being the best overall scorer of today. But all right, first game on the slate, it is the Minnesota Twins at the Detroit Tigers. Currently, no starting pitcher listed for the Tigers. It stands to reason it's not going to be anybody good because they have Jose Urena starting for them in the first end of the back-to-back. And then on the mound for the Twins, Kenta Maeda. One other thing to mention about this game, other than it's a doubleheader and a 7-inning game, there's also a little bit of weather concern. So it looks like there is about a 70% chance of rain here. So as of right now, for a whole couple of reasons, it's just out of my player pool. Number one, rain concern. Number two, doubleheader, generally a crappy situation. And then also we don't know the Tigers starting pitcher. So for me right now, I think this is an easy game, just kind of glance over.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, DraftKings has Matt Manning listed as the probable pitcher. I have no idea what that's based on, though. It's not on MLB.com. It's not, I don't know, there's not even like a link to an article in like the DraftKings blurb saying Matt Manning is going to pitch. So I don't know if they just kind of are guessing at it or what, but he's listed right now. We talked about him quite a bit recently that the strikeout numbers really haven't been there. It's a tough matchup. Everything you said, I agree with.
Yeah, and then just to go back to what Adam said, and then also what was brought up in the chat, because we had Eric Johnson thought it was Manning for the Tigers. So we don't have official starting pitchers for a lot of these teams. There is assumed starting pitchers, except number one, it just kind of guesses on DraftKings on a lot of them. If you click on the players, player card, if you go and look up any news on the player, it's just guesses based on when guys have pitched last. And that's not to say that can't be accurate. It's also, though, kind of hard to talk about just because it's not accounted for in our data right now, because it is not official yet, and it could ultimately end up being somebody else. So in at least if you look at our top stacks, so it's not going to be assuming that certain guys are starting pitchers right now. It's just kind of assuming a neutral matchup for a lot of these guys. But anyway, yeah, first game, hopefully it rains, and then it's not really gonna matter that much anyway. Next game, the Boston Red Sox against the New York Yankees. So this game does have a 10-run total, one of the higher run totals on the slate. Martin Perez going for Boston. The Yankees also no official starting pitcher named. And one thing that kind of bothers me about some of the All-Star break stuff is I don't understand why teams are just so willing to let their best pitchers go out and pitch in the All-Star game and throw like an inning or 2 innings or whatever, and they just lose them when they come out of the All-Star break. So for the Yankees, Garrett Cole didn't even pitch in the All-Star game and had a massive workload the game before. But I mean, I would kind of assume he would make most sense to start here, except apparently not the case. DraftKings does currently have Domingo Germán listed as the probable starter, but once again, that remains to be seen. But talk to me about the matchup the Yankees have against Martin Perez.
Yeah, do you see Perez confirmed somewhere? Because I see him listed on DraftKings, but I don't see him confirmed anywhere either. He's not in our pitcher data.
MLB.com has Martin Perez listed, so I generally tend to think, once MLB has it listed, I just kind of assume that to be official.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, assuming it is Perez, then I think it's a pretty good spot for the Yankees. I mean, Perez does a decent job of keeping the ball in the park, but he also doesn't miss a lot of bats, and that's always something that concerns me when you talk about how much power is in the Yankees lineup. So if it is Perez, I mean, I think going to any number of the right-handed power bats from the Yankees looks pretty good. Domingo Germán was going to start yesterday for the Yankees. If he makes the start today, I think it's an okay spot for Boston. Not my favorite pitcher to pick on, but he's not that good either. He's kind of dropped off from where he was a couple of years ago, where he looked like he had the potential to be a future ace. He's given up power, particularly to righties this year, 220 ISO allowed to righties. So I think it's a pretty high upside spot here for both offenses, and that's reflected in the total as well.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the thing I don't totally understand here, though, is so even though it's listed Domingo Germán as a starter, like Garrett Cole hasn't pitched since Saturday, and he pitched really well on Saturday against the Astros. Like, are they really going to give him a full week off? It seems to me like Garrett Cole would be ready to pitch, and it would just kind of make sense to throw him out there. But I mean, maybe not the case. We've got, an unknown starter, at least in terms of confirmed starters. DraftKings has it listed as Domingo Germán. So overall, a situation that's totally up in the air. As for Martin Perez, I think that there's a couple of one-offs that really make sense from the Yankees. Giancarlo Stanton, Aaron Judge, a couple of guys who have a lot of power upside and really just crush left-handed pitching. But as it comes to stacking against Martin Perez, it's not something I like to do all that regularly. He's a guy who usually outperforms his peripheral stats and just doesn't give up that many homers. He has a lot of starts where it's like, oh, Martin Perez went out, pitched 6 innings, gave up 3 runs. You don't want to play him in DFS, but oftentimes stacking against him doesn't yield all that much upside, especially because him being a ground ball pitcher, like you said, keeps the ball in the park. I mean, his home run totals, he gave up 2 last start, but he only has 2 starts the entire season where he's given up multiple home runs, and he's given up no home runs in just as many starts as he's given up any home runs. So Martin Perez, somebody who I generally don't really love to stack against. But once again, just relative to some of the other options we know about right now, some of the right-handed power bats who hit lefties well for the Yankees, Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, that is where I would be looking. Next game here, another one, which shocking. No starting pitcher listed on one of the sides of the game. The New York Mets at the Pittsburgh Pirates. There's also no spread or total for this game because the pitcher not known by sportsbooks here either. But Marcus Stroman on the mound for the Mets, unknown for Pittsburgh. I think JT Brubaker would make the most sense here. He'd be on full rest. He's been their best starter this year. But first, let's talk about Marcus Stroman, his spot against the Pirates. He was, super chalk in the same type of spot right before the All-Star break.
Yeah, I think the price tag's just too cheap for him. 7,900 is a pretty favorable price tag. Like when you talk about Stroman, he's not the best strikeout pitcher. He only comes in with a 20.5% strikeout percentage, but he doesn't walk a lot of guys. He's a good pitcher overall, allows fewer than 1 home run per 9 innings, 3.63 xFIP. He's the kind of pitcher that a lot of times on DraftKings, you see priced up because he's good at preventing runs, and it makes it really difficult to roster him because the strikeout stuff isn't as good as other expensive pitchers. But that's not the case today. He's only 7,900. He has a favorable matchup against one of the worst offenses in baseball, taking on the Pirates. He's at a price point where I think he really stands out, and he'll probably get a lot of ownership again. But I think that he deserves it because, again, it's a $7,900 price tag for a very good pitcher. Even like he's a better real life pitcher than he is a fantasy pitcher, but his salary is reflective of his fantasy potential more so than his real life potential. So I think he ends up coming in a little bit underpriced here.
Yeah, and we do have a relevant question in the YouTube chat going back to the Yankees-Boston game where Brett Narlick asked, aren't there COVID issues in the Boston-New York game? Listen, it is why it got canceled yesterday, but at least as of now, I haven't seen anything that it's at risk of being canceled today. So, I do agree that maybe seems a little bit weird that the game got canceled yesterday, but have you seen anything about the game potentially not being played today?
No, I haven't seen anything new. I mean, obviously we'll find out, but for now, I'm assuming that it plays. Maybe you just see. I don't remember who the 3 players were that tested positive for the Yankees, but I would assume you just don't see them play. My guess is they canceled yesterday just to kind of like make sure nothing got worse, and then today, assuming you don't get a bunch more positives, those guys won't play, and everybody else will be fine.
Yeah, I know that they had. I don't know that they said anybody officially tested positive. They said that Aaron Judge was among the Yankees players in the COVID-19 protocol overall. It's hard to know what that means. The Yankees had Aaron Judge, Kyle Higashioka, and Gio Urshela that are in the COVID protocol. But, I don't know exactly what all the MLB's protocols are. If they return a negative test today, maybe that means that they're available to play. I haven't seen anything they're officially ruled out or anything like that. So it's still something I think that we need more information on. And once again, I mean, the slate locks 8 hours from now. So we'll know by later in the day. But as of now, I'm assuming the game plays, and we don't know who's starting for the Yankees. For the Red Sox, it appears that Martin Perez will be on the mound. And then everything you said about Marcus Stroman, I agree. He's somebody I very rarely roster in DFS. For FanDuel purposes, I wouldn't play him on a single pitcher site. But on DraftKings as an SP2, just because he's so cheap, it makes sense to get to him. There's been a lot of sites where I haven't wanted to roster Marcus Stroman, but it's been because he's somebody who's, like 9,200, 9,400. And then it's just hard to justify seeing the upside in somebody with a 20.6% K rate. But given that he's cheap, he could just go out and throw 6 or 7 pretty good innings, strike out 4 hitters, maybe get up a run or 2. And that could be enough to be, a pretty good fantasy score relative to his cheaper price tag today. Next game that we have here, it is the San Diego Padres in Washington to take on the Nationals. Chris Paddock against Eric Fedde. Eric Fedde, not somebody who I would normally be expecting to be lined up for a start right after the All-Star break, but Max Scherzer started in the All-Star game, so I guess that's what has him unavailable to pitch today. But let's walk through Chris Paddock because he's somebody who has a whole lot of arm ability, but he's been all over the place. He's been super inconsistent. He's really hard for me to trust. And I actually have a little bit of interest in stacking against him just because he's been so inconsistent. And the Nationals, I assume, are ultimately going to a team that doesn't pick up all that much ownership. We have them projected for some right now, but I have a feeling that's going to go down once more pitchers get announced.
I'm really confused why Chris Paddock is only $6,300 on DraftKings and why he's not getting ownership at that price.
I mean, he's just been bad.
Well, I mean, he hasn't been bad. He's been not as good as he used to be, but I mean, he's still got a 23.5% strikeout percentage this year, 3.64 xFIP, 5.5% walk percentage. Like, I still think he's fine. He's coming off of a couple of bad starts, but
yeah,
6,300 makes no sense to me. And if he's not going to be popular, like I don't love the matchup against the Nats. I do believe that there's reason for concern based on how he's pitched recently. He hasn't gone 3 innings in 3 of his last 4 starts, but at the same time, I mean, we know the talent level that Paddock has. The stuff is good in general. It's not a great matchup against Washington, but 6,300 to me just kind of takes like most of the risk away and gives you a lot of upside. It's a spot where I'll pay a lot of attention to ownership, because if that ownership goes up, I'll be looking to get more Nats bats in tournaments, because you'll be able to knock off a decent percentage of the field if Paddock does struggle. And, again, it is a volatile spot, but if the ownership stays as low as it is right now, I would rather just be playing a lot of Chris Paddock and betting on the talent there at one of the cheapest price points you'll probably see for the rest of his career.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it's cheap. He's fine as an SP2 on DraftKings. I don't mind mixing him into some lineups, but right now I have him projected for about 9.5% ownership. But I also like stacking against him. It's been such a rough couple of months for him. He pitched really well in May, and then June was no good for him. July was no good. So 5.59 ERA in June, his July ERA 9.82. That's only in 11 innings. But still, I mean, some of the numbers in July, his K rate has dipped all the way down to 20.4%. He isn't walking people either, except just a lot of hard contact, and the underlying number is still a 5.53 FIP. So there's definitely a lot of recency bias there, both in terms of the pricing and the ownership. But I think it's a good GPP spot to be on both sides of, given the information we know right now. It doesn't look like Paddock's going to be super popular. It doesn't look like Washington's going to be super popular. 3.4% projected ownership to them as a team. And, Paddock has been somebody who's been all over the map this year. I don't think, I'll look through his game log, but off the top of my head, I don't think he's had any mediocre starts. I think it's either been really bad starts or really good starts. And if you look through, a lot of his games recently, like go back to, San Diego game against the Reds. He pitched 5 innings, struck out 11 hitters, gave up 2 runs. Then he follows it up. He pitches 2 1/3 innings, gives up 5 runs. Then he makes through 7 innings, giving up 3 runs. Then he pitches 2 innings and gives up 9 runs. So, really all over the place with Chris Paddock. Very inconsistent, but a lot of GPP upside on both sides. So that's something that is going to interest me for tournaments. And then the other side, Eric Fetty pitching for Washington. Once again, not somebody that I would expect to be starting coming out of the All-Star break, except given that Max Scherzer pitched in the All-Star game. We have Eric Fetty, who's delivered pretty mediocre results this year, 4.59 ERA, 4.97 expected ERA. I have no interest in him for tournament purposes. However, the Padres, the reason that they warrant discussion, they're right now projected for the second most ownership of any team on the slate. And we see these spots all the time with MLB. It is a good spot for the Padres. I just don't think the ownership warrants what their odds are being a top stack.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Like, they're the 3rd highest top stack percentage right now, but they're getting the 2nd most ownership, and it's a pretty big gap even between 2 and 3. So I agree that it's a pretty good spot against Fetty, but they are projected to be over-owned. It's a 14-game slate where obviously there's a lot of good offensive spots. Eric Fetty's not great, but he's also not completely terrible. I think, if the ownership comes down, I'll certainly be interested in the Padres. But the way that it looks right now, I wouldn't be that interested in going there. Fetty has struggled a bit more with right-handed power than left-handed power this year, for what it's worth. 202 expected ISO to righties. If you go back to last season, 209 expected ISO to righties. So, if you want to take shots on Pham, Tatis, Machado, I think that's fine. But they are projected for a lot of ownership as a team.
Yeah, as it stands now, just based on my process, how I roster teams, I don't know that I have any Padres stacks, just given how overowned they are. We have them with a -8 leverage score on FanDuel. That is the most negatively leveraged team on FanDuel. And then on DraftKings, we also have them 11.5% projected ownership, 6.6% odds being a top stack. It's the most negatively leveraged team there as well. There's a whole lot of teams to get to on this slate. And unless something changes with some of these odds, which these are more apt to change during the day than on most slates, just because we don't know so many of the starting pitchers. But as it stands now, they just look really overowned. They're also pretty expensive. So it's not a team that I would be looking to stack personally.
One other thing to add on Paddock really quickly, and I'm not even saying this like advocating for him, but I did just want to point it out, because typically when we see a pitcher's results change pretty drastically, a lot of times it can be tracked back to, a drop in spin rate or something like that. I don't have the data from his most recent start on the 11th, but prior to that, Paddock hadn't seen a drop in his spin rate. His called strike plus swinging strike percentage had actually gone up a little bit. His expected WOBA had gone down a little bit since they started checking on, foreign substances. So I still agree, like, he's inconsistent and all of that, but I do at least feel a little bit better that we haven't seen any real red flags in underlying substance related stuff.
Yeah, it's the other thing too is not spend, like half the show talking about Chris Paddock, but we only have like 7 relevant pitchers to talk about right now. But he's been a guy who ever since his rookie year, he's been inconsistent. We've seen him pop up some good starts and he has some bad ones. I don't know there's anything in the data that would point to why that's been the case. I just think he is somebody who's very inconsistent. And given where he's priced on DraftKings, it just adds appeal to both sides of the game, because which Chris Paddock is going to show up, it's anybody's guess. It's been so inconsistent. Whether it's a good matchup, bad matchup, it hasn't really seemed to matter. He gets bombed sometimes. He pitches really well sometimes, even against, pretty decent offenses. Like that start I mentioned against the Reds, where he struck out 11 hitters in 5 innings. And then, a week later, he's given up 9 runs in an inning. So it's really hard to nail him down, but a lot of variance there, which is kind of par for the course for MLB DFS. But next game, somebody who used to be really inconsistent has actually returned, very strong results this year. It is the Toronto Blue Jays with Robbie Ray on the mound going up against Jordan Lyles and the Texas Rangers. Robbie Ray, a guy who, not quite as crazy and consistent as what we've seen from Chris Paddock recently, but he was certainly in that same kind of realm. But this year we've seen really strong results from Robbie Ray. The biggest reason has been that he's just throwing more strikes this year. 6.2% walk rate. That is by far the lowest of his career. and that he's still been able to strike out 32% of the hitters he faces. He's totally changed his game just by being able to throw more strikes, less runners on base. That also enables him to work deeper into games. So 3.13 ERA for Robbie Ray with a 3.79 expected ERA. Also pairing that with all the strikeout stuff. He is overall, I think, the safest pitcher to go to today on the high end, just because it's a good matchup against the Rangers and how consistently good he's been.
Yeah, I think he's the top guy. We have him number one in top 2 pitcher percentage. One other thing to add, in addition to everything you said, obviously the lower walk rate is a really, really big deal for Ray. But then even looking at this Texas lineup, I think it sets up pretty favorably for him, because we know it's not a very good offense overall. When you think about the guys on this team that actually can do some damage, they're mostly left-handed hitters. Joey Gallo's a lefty. Nate Lowe's a lefty. You may have Holt leading off left-handed. David Dahl's left-handed. Robbie Ray has struck out 35.6% of left-handed hitters this year. He's held them to a 126 expected ISO. He still strikes out righties at 31%, but he has allowed a 196 expected ISO. So when you look at Robbie Ray, the most likely spot for a team to do damage against him is if they have right-handed power bats. And excluding Adolis Garcia, the Rangers really don't have that. So on top of everything else positive to say about Robbie Ray, I think it sets up as a particularly good matchup.
Yeah, and then Robbie Ray also, like I said, I mean, it's crazy that he's gone from a guy who was so inconsistent to just basically being able to throw strikes, how it's totally turned his game around. The last time he gave up more than 3 runs in a start was May 27th in New York against the Yankees. So it's been very consistently good results this year for Robbie Ray. He actually has only allowed more than 3 runs at home once the entire season. That was May 16th against the Phillies. So the strikeout numbers have been excellent for Robbie Ray. He's somebody who's going to be a very high priority for me on this slate, especially once we've gotten to a point in the season now with baseball, with all the foreign substance things and all the inconsistencies with pitchers. He's been one guy who we can feel really consistently good about, both in terms of strikeouts and results. So Robbie Ray, a very high priority play for me on the slate. And then on the other side of the game, Jordan Lyles going up against the Toronto Blue Jays. Really a recipe for disaster. Jordan Lyles has not been particularly good this year, and the Blue Jays offense has been about as good as an offense could possibly be. And the other thing also to mention about Toronto here, due to their expensive price tags, it looks like they're going a little bit under-owned. So I look at a team like the Toronto Blue Jays compared to the Padres, and the Padres have more than double the ownership, but we actually have the Blue Jays with a better overall chance of being a top stack. So to me, if I'm paying up for an offense, I prefer the Blue Jays to the Padres.
Yeah, right there with you. The salaries should help keep the ownership down, but there's a couple of things to like. For one, Jordan Lyles, like you said, hasn't been good basically for most of his career, but also this season, giving up power to both sides of the play, particularly to righties, but 177 expected ISO to lefties, 192 to righties, striking out less than 20% of hitters from both sides. But also with Toronto, you have expensive hitters, basically 1 through 4 with Semien, Bichette, Guerrero, and Springer. But the rest of the lineup still has power, but they also let you save some money to sort of balance out what you're spending on that stack. Nobody else in the projected lineup is above Teoscar Hernandez at 4,400 on DraftKings. So it's not even like you have to really break the bank to get to them. There's a lot of different ways you can stack them and still get upside in there. So I like the way that the pricing sets up. I like the fact that really 1 through 9, or at least 1 through 8, depending on who the catcher is, there's going to be power in this lineup, and they are projected to go on their own, as you said.
Yeah, and that's really the key thing here is, I mean, if the ownership was, all the same between teams like Toronto and the Padres, then that would be, a different story. But I mean, this is amongst the expensive teams on the slate. It does look like the team is going the most under-owned. So tournament purposes, I really like the Blue Jays there. They do have hefty price tags to pay, but this is also kind of a weird slate where even though it's coming out of the All-Star break and we've had a lot of time off, the current pitchers that we have in play right now on DraftKings, the most expensive pitcher is Kevin Gausman at 10,300. Even somebody like Robbie Ray, who I think we like a lot, he's only 9,300. He probably warrants being, $1,000 to $1,500 more expensive. So to me, and then even on FanDuel, Robbie Ray single pitcher site only 9,800. So with Robbie Ray being underpriced as a pay up option and pitcher, I think it's fairly easy to spend up at offense today compared to some other spots that we've had this year. So I think that's going to be a priority for me today, is trying to get in some of these expensive offense that might be a little bit under-owned. Next game on the slate, it is the Milwaukee Brewers at the Cincinnati Reds. I think that there's a lot to talk about here with Tyler Mahle, another guy who seems to be pretty impacted by the change in foreign substance rules. There's still strikeout upside here, but another guy kind of in the same vein as Chris Paddock. The results have been all over the place with Tyler Mahle. So, last time out, especially the walk numbers, he's walked 4 guys in back-to-back starts. That's going to be a concern. But Adam, I know you've been tracking a lot of the change in spin rates. And if I remember correctly, Tyler Mahle is one of the guys who's been impacted the most.
Yeah, like I said, I haven't updated since July 9th, so I missed the last start, I believe. But if you sort just by total change in spin rate, Molly's got the ninth highest change out of the 164 pitchers that I have data on. So yeah, you have seen that, and then you have seen the walk numbers go up a bit. I still think that the ceiling is high for him, but I do think that there's a lot of volatility here. Even if you go back to his last start, you kind of saw it. It was against this Milwaukee team. It looked like he might not even get out of the first inning in that start. He was walking guys, putting guys on base. Then he ended up turning in a pretty good start. That also happened to be the start where I don't remember the exact number anymore, but the number or the percentage of missed calls by the home plate umpire was like the highest in baseball all season long. And you had plenty of instances of Mahle just getting favorable calls on pitch 3, 4, 5 inches outside. So we don't really know how that start goes if you have an umpire that is actually like competent behind the plate either. So the point being here, I think there's a lot of volatility. Like Tyler Mahle is one of the best strikeout pitchers on the slate at 29.5% this year. He certainly can go out there and mow down this Milwaukee lineup, but he also is very capable of going out there, walking a bunch of guys, driving up his pitch count, getting himself in trouble, and not going too deep into this game. So I think at 8,200, he's a reasonably good option in tournaments. We have him with the second highest top 2 pitcher percentage on the slate, but he is also projected right now, and again, this will change throughout the day. But right now he's projected for the second most ownership as well, behind only Andrew Heaney. So I do think that in larger field tournaments, I would probably end up underweight to Mahle and probably end up going overweight on some of the other pitchers I like, and then mixing in some Milwaukee bats to try and leverage against him if his ownership holds where it is right now.
Yeah, I really like the idea of stacking against Mahle while also getting exposure to him in tournaments, just from a standpoint of, number one, if this ownership holds, I'm going to be underweight to the field on Mahle and GPPs, because 34%, I think that's a little bit high for somebody with as much volatility as he has. Milwaukee Brewers also, now that Christian Yelich is, a little bit healthier and is in the lineup, which he wasn't early in the year, I do think the Brewers are going to have a better offense against right-handed pitching than they did earlier in the year. But right now we look at the Brewers only projected for 2% ownership. With all this ownership going to Mahle, I think in large field GPP is totally sensible to get like 5 to 6%. Brewer stacks, get overweight to the field, and a little bit of leverage against Mahle, because once again, he's somebody a lot of strikeout upside, but also there's a lot of bust potential there for Mahle. And his home run totals his last 4 starts, he's given up home runs in at least 3 of them. The walks have been an issue, but the strikeouts are still there for him. So once again, a lot of volatility in the spot, not quite as much as Chris Paddock, but still pretty significant there. And then on the other side of the game, Adrian Houser going up against the Cincinnati Reds, somebody who I don't usually get all that much exposure to. We don't typically see him work all that deep into games. I'm going to bring up his pitch count from recent starts really quickly. But Houser this year, if you look at his pitch counts, they have been, a little bit higher in recent games, but still, if you look at his innings pitched, he's only gone past, he's made it through 6 innings 4 times the entire season. Honestly, with 14 games, it's just really hard for me to think that somebody like that, who generally doesn't work deep into games, has all that much upside.
Yeah, I don't really see a reason to get to Houser here, because like you said, he doesn't typically go that deep in the games. The matchup against Cincinnati is not great. He only strikes out about 18.5% of hitters this year. And then also, if you do need to pay down, you have Paddock, who's a better pitcher at 6,300. I don't really think that's debatable, higher upside and just a better pitcher. But then you also have, we haven't talked about him yet, you have Danny Duffy at 7K against the Orioles. You have Andrew Heaney at 7,400 against Seattle. So you have guys in this price range that just give you drastically higher ceilings than Adrian Houser does as well.
Yeah, and then also to bring up, because some people are asking about the weather concern, as of right now, it does seem that there is some, except it looks like the rain's probably going to come later on in the game. So we have a 24% chance of rain at the start of the game. By the time the game is finishing around 9 p.m. Central Time, then it's up to a 50% chance of rain. So if something happens where the storms look like they're going to hit potentially earlier than later, then the game definitely becomes at risk. As of right now, it's not anything that's causing me to take the game out of my player pool. But certainly something that's a concern early on, and then just another weather situation to monitor. Also, all the reason, guys, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, do us a favor while you're at it and like the video, because later on in the day, we've got the deeper dive. I'm pretty sure Adam's going to be on that. And then I'll be doing live before lock later on in the day with Eric Lindquist. And we'll have, more information on, number one, the weather. And then we'll also know who the pitchers are, which that's kind of helpful for MLB DFS. So check those shows out later. The next game that we have here on the slate, it is the Houston Astros against the Chicago White Sox. The White Sox, at least at the time we had started, had not named a starting pitcher. Let me check to make sure that's still the case, because that would be pretty significant if we had a White Sox starting pitcher. But on the mound for the Houston Astros is going to be Lance McCullers. McCullers has been solid this year, a little bit of a drop in his velocity since undergoing Tommy John surgery. He's thrown about a mile per hour less, but at his kind of price tag with strikeout upside, sub 10% ownership, I think McCullers, not somebody I want to consider in cash games, but for tournament purposes, I think that he's worth being overweight to the field on.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really like taking guys against the White Sox. I mean, it's a good offense. It scares me. And McCullers, in his own right, is a pretty scary pitcher to roster because he's just so hit or miss in terms of what he's able to do. But the strikeout stuff's still been pretty solid this year. 28.9% against righties, 23.1% against lefties. Hasn't really allowed power to anyone. At 9,100, I think he's fine. He's certainly someone you can use as a pivot to Robbie Ray, with Ray getting like 3 or 4 times the ownership right now. So I don't feel really strongly one way or the other on McCullers, but I do think in tournaments he does give you upside at his price. I would much rather go to Robbie Ray in cash games.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely. Robbie Ray is somebody that I'd consider, and also Robbie Ray is somebody I'm going to overall get a lot more exposure to. But just looking at Lance McCullers right now is a guy we have projected for 8% ownership, and then a 12% chance of being a top 2 pitcher on the slate. Just somebody who I'd be, maybe double the field or something like that. That's just something that makes sense to me, especially when, there's a lot of pitchers we've talked about that are pretty inconsistent today. So for that reason, I think Lance McCullers is worth being overweight to the field in tournaments. I don't really have interest in stacking against him. On the mound for the White Sox, it appears it's going to be Dylan Cease. I see that we have that in our data right now, and he is listed on DraftKings. MLB.com, at least last I looked, they did not have Cease listed as a starter. So maybe not totally 100% confirmed, but it does seem like he is the most likely pitcher who's going to be on the mound for the White Sox. So Cease is a guy who he's had, okay results this year. What's most beneficial to him from a fantasy perspective, though, is just the strikeout numbers have been so high this year, 29.5% strikeout rate. I really don't like the matchup against the Houston Astros, so I don't think I'm going to be getting to Cease. But I think it's worth noting that he's very low owned. There's a little bit of strikeout upside, but I just don't like the matchup.
Yeah, it feels like the 10th starter in a row or something for Cease, where it's been like he has one of the highest strikeout percentages on the slate, but there's better plays, so his ownership's going to be low. I think I would rather just go to other spots. I don't like the matchup against Houston. I think even though McCullers is higher owned, he's still low enough owned where I'd rather get to McCullers than Cease. If you want to play Cease, I'm not going to talk you off of it in larger field tournaments because the upside certainly is there for a pitcher that's probably going to only get 2 or 3% ownership or around there. But I just think that I can find low enough owned plays on a 14-game slate that don't involve rostering a pitcher against the Astros.
Yeah, there's 14 games, a lot of spots to choose from. So Cease, I guess the question here then becomes when it as it pertains to the Houston Astros, they do have one of the best offenses in baseball, and see in the top stack store for them right now, we have them picking up very, very low ownership. Would you be willing to stack against Dylan Cease?
I don't mind it. Houston's one of those offenses that I'll kind of just stack against anybody if their ownership is low. I do think Cease is a good pitcher. Like, he's not someone I'm going out of my way to target. Right now, we have the Astros getting, I think, 2.5% aggregate ownership, a little shy of that. I could see getting a little bit overweight there. I kind of doubt that they end up being a team, one of my highest owned stacks, just because Cease isn't going to get any ownership, so it's not checking that box. The Astros are towards the top in top stack percentage, but there's plenty of teams, above them. I think I probably end up overweight, but not getting like crazy amounts because I do think Cease is a good pitcher.
All right, and now we could answer Blitz's question in the YouTube chat, because saying Charlie Morton, a yay or a nay today. And next game we have here, it is the Atlanta Braves at home against the Tampa Bay Rays. Michael Wacha has produced some better results as of late for Tampa Bay. Not somebody, I'm not sure I've rostered Michael Wacha at all this year. I can't remember actually last time I've really rostered Michael Wacha at all, but Charlie Morton, due to his strikeout upside, I think that he is somebody who's worth getting to on the slate. He is also somebody who has pitched fairly well even ever since the foreign substance crackdown. So Charlie Morton's numbers for the year, 3.64 ERA, 3.96 expected ERA. That's all solid, but the thing that I'm really looking at here, 27.7% K rate. Charlie Morton is really good stuff, and I do like to get to him even in a tough matchup against the Rays.
Yeah, 31.2% K percentage against left-handed hitters, specifically 137 expected ISO. Definitely nice to see when you're talking about a Rays lineup that most likely will have two right-handed bats plus the pitcher. So it makes me like Morton, it at least makes me, if not like him more, it at least kind of comforts me that he's having a lot of success against opposite-handed hitters. And that's something you've seen from him in the past, too, because he's able to use the curveball really effectively against left-handed bats. So it is a dangerous lineup, but I think it's a situation where as long as Morton has his stuff and, it's not just a random game where Morton is struggling to locate, I think the advantage still goes to Morton. It's mainly just that Tampa is a dangerous enough offense where if Morton doesn't have his command, they certainly are good enough to take advantage. But I would still think as long as Morton's on top of his game, he has the advantage here. The salary is very reasonable. Ownership's a little bit high, but other than that, I don't have anything negative to say about Morton. I think that he's one of the better pitching options.
Yeah, and then on the other side, Michael Wacha going up against the Braves. I do like the idea of picking on the Braves offense a little bit in the short term because I don't think that the industry is totally adjusted for Ronald Acuna out for the year with a torn ACL. I think that some of the Braves odds at sports books of winning the division, making the playoffs this year, I think they're a little bit overvalued. The issue with Michael Wacha, though, is you look at his pitch count. So he went 90 pitches last game. Look at his pitch counts before that: 70, 75, 77, 28, 42. Wacha typically doesn't work super deep into games. And then also, some of his numbers this year, they're bad: 4.87 ERA, 6.36 expected ERA. And then as now he's getting into a spot where maybe he's getting stretched out a little bit to throw pitches in the 70s range as opposed to, like the 40s. He's only going to be less effective now that he has to face guys multiple times. So Michael Wacha, I don't really have any interest in him whatsoever, but the Braves as a stack, the thing that's just a little prohibitive with me getting to them is I just don't like this offense a whole lot without Ronald Acuna.
Yeah, it just makes such a big difference when you take Acuna out of this lineup because when he's in there, it's kind of a team where it's like, okay, cool, I get Acuna, I get Freeman, I get Albies, and I can live with guys like Riley and Swanson. When you take Acuna out of there, it's kind of like, okay, I get to pay a lot of money for Freeman and Albies, and then I get guys that I just don't really want. Wacha has been decent through 90 pitches, like you said. I could see having some interest in Wacha on some slates. I don't really on this slate though, because again, I would just rather go to, unless there ends up being a huge ownership difference, I would just rather go to Chris Paddock at 6,300. I'd rather go to Danny Duffy at 7K.
Yeah, there's and then we're gonna talk about that game in a second. Has Danny Duffy been confirmed as the starter?
I don't think so. But
okay,
yeah, DraftKings has him. Nobody else does, I guess.
Yeah, I think it would make sense that Danny Duffy's going to be the starter, and then we could transition to talk about that game now because it is next up. Keegan Aiken on the mound for the Orioles, and Keegan Aiken. Listen, I make fun of these teams for throwing crappy starting pitchers out coming out of the All-Star break, but the Orioles are one of the teams that don't have a choice. There is no good starting pitcher to go to here, but Keegan Aiken on the mound for them. On the mound for the for the Royals. If Danny Duffy does get the start, he would be interesting to me just because he's cheap, he's good, and I assume we start to see him get to normal pitch counts now. He was really limited coming off the injured list, and we saw his pitch count to the point where he was throwing 42 pitches in his first start, then 62, 69, 77 pitches. I think we see him back to normal rates, 90 plus if he does start, so that would be something that's sensible to me. Also, I think he is the Royals' best starting pitcher, so I would assume him to be on the mound today. So we don't know for sure, but just would you agree that if Danny Duffy does end up starting, he'd actually be a very high priority play on DraftKings?
Yeah, the only real concern, so I'd have like 1.5 concerns, I guess. I always mention with the Orioles, but like the middle of their order concerns me for somebody like Duffy. Like Hayes, Mancini, Mountcastle, Santander, those guys can do some damage. Mullins obviously is good, but lefty-lefty matchup favors Duffy. But it's just like the Orioles are a team where like the top of their order, I think, actually is dangerous, but then the bottom is just so bad that it offsets it. And then the other concern would be that the pitch count just hasn't gotten up as quickly as we would like. But coming off the All-Star break, I'm with you. I'm assuming he gets at least close to a normal amount of pitches. So at 7K, it's kind of a price point that mitigates those concerns anyway. They'd be more important to me if Duffy were like 8,500 or something like that. But at 7K, if he is starting, I do think Duffy looked like a good option.
And then we've got in the YouTube chat here, we've got Eric Johnson, regular watch for the show. We appreciate anybody making comments, asking questions. He was asking us if Keegan Aiken is a good option to go to just because he's so cheap today on DraftKings. To me, that is a no. I think here's one of the things too about this slate. The high-end pitchers to pay up for, they're not that expensive. So to me, I think that taking a chance on somebody like Keegan Aiken, there's just not a need to on this kind of slate. Like I understand there's a Coors Field game that we're going to talk about in a sec. That has a massive run total. That's going to be really popular. But Keegan Aiken's results this year, he has a 7.54 ERA, a 5.93 expected ERA. He doesn't really strike a lot of guys out, 21.5% K rate. So it's really hard for me to reasonably say that it's ever going to make sense to roster Keegan Aiken. And on this slate in particular, it makes even less sense than normal.
Yeah. And in addition to the top end pitchers not being that expensive, like you don't have, an 11.5 DeGrom or something like that today, there's also a lot of strikeout upside, around like 7K, give or take. You have Duffy on the other side of this game. We haven't gotten to him yet. You have Andrew Heaney at 7,400. You have Chris Paddock at 6,300. Like these guys are basically, obviously they're more expensive than Keegan Aiken, but they're basically like one bat more expensive. They're going from like, a $5,500 one-off to a $3,500 one-off. And on a 14-game slate, it's not going to be difficult to find bats in the mid 3K range that give you plenty of upside. So to me, I don't really see a reason to go to Aiken on this slate in particular.
Yeah, and then once again, we are currently thinking that Danny Duffy, probably the most likely starting pitcher for the Kansas City Royals. He is listed as the starting pitcher on DraftKings, the probable starting pitcher, but not confirmed in our data. Also, not confirmed right now on MLB.com. So no official starting pitcher for the Royals. It would make sense if Danny Duffy is the guy on the mound. And by the way, guys, all this stuff, MLB top pitchers, that is free for today on Awesemo.com. And some of this data, it's going to get updated during the day as we get more information. If you do want access to more of the MLB data that we have up on Awesemo.com, if you're new to signing up for the site, head on over to the site, sign up for an Awesemo Plus weekly pass, and use the promo code MLB Strategy Show. That's all one word, all capital letters. You get 25% off your first week of Awesemo Plus Platinum. Moving on to the next game here. It is the San Francisco Giants against the St. Louis Cardinals. Wait for this, Cardinals. No starting pitcher. At least the good news here. Do we know a starting pitcher now?
Yeah, Wainwright was confirmed like 2 minutes ago.
Oh, perfect. Well, there we go. So with that said, we now know all the rest of the starting pitchers, the rest of the games we're going to talk about. So Adam Wainwright on the mound against the Giants. Now, obviously, I haven't really dug into the data much because as of 18 seconds ago, I didn't know that he was going to be the starting pitcher. But in general, with Adam Wainwright this year, I very rarely roster him, but I also don't really like to stack against him. Pretty middle of the road pitcher, and I'll pull up some of his numbers here really quick. But also, what is his salary today? Do you
7,700 on DraftKings, and where did it go? 8,800 on FanDuel.
Yeah, that's more than I'm going to want to pay for Wainwright. I mean, 3.58 ERA, 4.13 expected ERA. Once again, those are fine numbers. Definitely somebody I don't want to stack against, but 22.6% K rate. There's a lot of starting pitching options kind of in the mid-range that I think are sensible today. And Adam Wainwright, at least at first glance, is not going to be one of those guys for me.
Yeah, like if you're playing 150 on DraftKings, I can see getting the sum at 7,700, especially if the ownership's low. But he doesn't stand out as someone that I really love. Like I just think you get more strikeout upside from guys like Duffy and Andrew Heaney for a little bit less than you do from Wainwright.
Yeah, and then also to answer News Guy on Negro Loco, because I know he gets upset when we don't get his messages during the show. It is easy for me for basketball to just pay attention to news because that's the number one thing I'm looking at. Baseball shows, I have so much data in front of me on my screen that it's hard for me to also monitor Slack. So I'm just generally looking for any questions I get asked. I look in the YouTube chat, but yeah, if something just comes up, and also I'm not usually expecting breaking news during baseball shows, so not something I'm usually on the lookout for during baseball. But there we go. Adam Wainwright is confirmed as a starter, but looks like it's not really have all that much implication on the slate for me. I don't like the Giants. I don't really like getting to Wainwright, but Kevin Gausman, maybe a little shockingly, the most expensive starting pitcher on the slate on DraftKings, 10,300 on FanDuel, 10,600. I get that Gausman's been really good this year. It's just not a price I really want to pay for him.
Yeah, I don't love the price, but I do think we should pay a lot of attention in tournaments to the ownership here because right now, and again, these are going to change as more pitchers roll in, but I think the trend itself will hold. You're getting 33% ownership going to Robbie Ray for $1,000 less than Kevin Gausman, who's only getting 14%. I do think that's a pretty nice gap. Like if you're stacking a team that $1,000 doesn't really matter, like, one of the cheaper teams, or you have cheap one-offs you like or whatever, I don't think Robbie Ray is beating Kevin Gausman 3 times to 1. And again, it's something that I've made fun of people for in the past. Like it doesn't just come down to these one player pivots. It has to do with, the total ownership of your team. But I do think that is one spot you could look to where the ownership does, I think, make sense to take some shots on Gausman, maybe be a little bit overweight there because he has been excellent this year. Only a 3.3 implied run total for St. Louis. He has the second highest strikeout percentage behind Robbie Ray on the slate at 3.5%. So, again, I think Ray is the better play, like just for lack of a better word. He's cheaper. He has a higher strikeout percentage. He's also in a good spot, but that's also reflected in the ownership. So I do think that's at least a spot you can look to pivot in tournaments if you continue to get 2.5, 3-1 ownership going to Robbie Ray.
Yeah, and then I mean, once again, Kevin Gausman, he's been good this year. It's just to your point, yeah, it depends on what some of the ownership is on him here. I certainly don't want to stack against him at all. Kevin Gausman this year, 1.73 ERA, 2.84 expected ERA. I just think points per dollar, there's probably guys that make a little bit more sense priced below him. But right now on DraftKings, we only project for 14% ownership. And, that's not really all that significant of a number. But I still think there's other guys who ultimately, in the build I made this morning, I wasn't really getting to Kevin Gausman, but that's also with, like half the pitchers missing and not knowing exactly which offense I'm going to get to. But two offenses that are going to be very important for this slate because it's being played at Coors Field. Julio Urias on the mound against Antonio Senzatello. So this game, 11.5 run total, by far the highest on the slate. However, with that also comes massive ownership on the Los Angeles Dodgers today. We have them projected for a little bit over 20% ownership today, which is a little bit on the high side. But once again, it's kind of in line with what we have them projected for in terms of top stack odds. On FanDuel, we have them with almost being exactly perfect ownership in terms of expected odds of being a top scoring team. On DraftKings, we have them with a 20.8% ownership share, 19.8% chance to be a top stack. So all that considered, a lot of ownership going to the Dodgers, a lot more than I would usually get to on an individual team on a 14-game slate. But it seems sensible given their odds of being a top stack today.
Yeah, it's another one of those teams like we were getting last week with every team that played the Orioles, whether it be last week, I guess, the White Sox or the Blue Jays. I think a lot of it is going to depend on the size contest you're playing. If you're playing, whatever the DraftKings tournament is with $50K to first, like $18, $15, whatever it is today, where you have to beat, 15,000 teams, I think you're going to care a little bit more about the fact that the Dodgers are projected for about 20% aggregate ownership, even though they are very likely to be the top scoring team on the slate. That just means, you're competing with thousands of teams that have to stack. If you're playing like the $888 with a few hundred entries total, you're not quite as concerned if 20 or 25% of those entries have them, because just the raw number of teams that you need to beat is lower, and they're not really projected to be over-owned. So I think that is something where the larger tournaments that I'm playing, I'm weighting things a little bit differently. So raw ownership matters a little bit more. Leverage maybe matters a little bit more. Whereas in smaller field stuff, leverage against the opposing pitcher matters a little bit more. Whereas in smaller field stuff, I'm more interested in like the top stack leverage than I am the raw ownership, because it's just not as big a field. So I do think they're the team that really stands out on this slate, where even though their top stack percentage is far and away the highest on the slate, you still have to keep in mind that 80% of the time they're not going to be the top stack, and 20% of the field is still going there. So it really just kind of comes down to like, how many lineups is 20% of the field, and how lucky do you have to get to beat them, basically.
Yeah, and then one other thing I'm going to add in here about the Dodgers, there's not one individual player we could go to try to differentiate the stacks. Right now, the least popular player in the entire lineup is Chris Taylor, who's priced over 5,000 on DraftKings, also picking up 15% ownership. So everybody throughout the lineup is fairly popular. And so even using some of these guys as one-offs, like there is no contrarian play. We've got Max Muncy, 26% projected ownership, Mookie Betts, 23, Bellinger, 24, Turner, 18, and then, like I said, Chris Taylor, 15, all these other guys, in the neighborhood, 16 to 26% owned. So there's no way to go to at the bottom of the lineup, even where you're pulling somebody out. It's like, oh, well, I have this one guy at Coors Field I could get to who's only picking up 6% ownership. That's not really the case anybody here. Everybody's going to be pretty popular across the Dodgers lineup. But once again, it looks about appropriate, something I'm probably going to be about in lockstep with the field and be about even. On the other side of the game, I really like Julio Urias as a pitcher. But still, I think whenever you can get an ownership discount on a Coors Field game, it's worth going to it. It's still Coors Field. There's a lot of upside. The Rockies offense is absolutely miserable, but still, it's a team with only 2.2% projected ownership playing at Coors Field. With that in mind, I think the Rockies are one of the stronger contrarian stacks on the slate. There is a whole lot of upside here. Urias is good, but still, I mean, Trevor Story is the most popular player in the entire Rockies team right now. He's only projected for 5% ownership. So as a contrarian stack, and also the Rockies aren't even that expensive for playing at Coors Field outside of Story. We've got Story at 5,400 and then everybody else below 5,000, guys like Crone 4,400, Blackman 4,400. I like the Rockies as a contrarian stack just because of the park factor. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. This team's so effing bad. I think I'd be more inclined to just like take one-offs with like Trevor Story and move on. I get what you're saying. Now, anytime you can get 2% ownership on a stacking course field, it's nice. They do still have almost a 5 implied run total. I get it. I kind of think I'd rather go to Urias at 1% ownership than go to the Rockies at 2. You are getting a discount on Urias at 7,800 because he's pitching in Coors. He's facing this god-awful team. He's only projected for about 1.5% ownership. He's coming off of a start where he threw 101 pitches on July 8th, which is the most he's thrown recently. So I get what you're saying about the Rockies. I don't have any strong disagreements there. But I'll also add Urias to that, where he's another one of these mid-7K guys that has a really, really high ceiling.
Yeah, I mean, Urias, we've seen from him this year. I mean, even times where, there's been spots where it's like, oh, Urias, maybe a tough matchup. He could be on the road or something like that. And then all of a sudden you look up, it's like, well, Urias has struck out, 10 guys. We saw this a couple weeks ago against the Cubs. He pitched 5 1/3 innings, struck out 12 hitters. Last time out against the Marlins, that's an easier matchup. Still 9 strikeouts in 7 innings. So a guy who, a little bit all over the place, but there's certainly a lot of strikeout upside there. So there's no ownership on either side, and something has to give. The Rockies are pretty cheap. They have a 5 implied run total, only 2% projected ownership. Real Urias, he's pretty cheap and only 1% projected ownership. So this is another spot where I think there's a little bit of GPP upside in both sides of the game.
I have the Rockies numbers against left-handed pitching since 2019. CJ Cron, 147 WRC plus, 291 ISO, really good. Trevor Story, 128 WRC plus, 252 ISO. Blackman, 119 WRC plus, 196 ISO. Then you move on. Hampson, 88 WRC plus for Hampson, 83 for Tapia, 81 for McMahon, 78 for Daza, 71 for Rogers, 57 for Diaz, 64 if Fuentes is in the lineup. So, again, I think I would just rather target, especially if the individual ownership on all these guys is going to be pretty low, I would just rather target the ones that are actually good, like Story and Crone and Blackman, and then just not worry about the rest of these guys.
I actually think Crone might be my favorite one-off on the slate. Just looking through everything right now, he's so cheap and he's picking up no ownership. And like you said right there, he's actually been successful against left-handed pitching, just, overall WRC plus. That's considering neutral parks. And then you put him in Coors Field, and the fact there's no ownership going there, I really like him as a one-off. I'm gonna say right now that is that's my home run pick for the day, CJ Cron.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. Someone asked, does Urias' heavy usage of the curveball worry you at Coors? Yes and no. The way I kind of look at that in general is if Urias were at like a 9K salary or something like he should be against the Rockies, I would be more concerned because then you're not really getting a Coors discount. But since you are getting the Coors discount, I kind of just lump that all in together. Like the fact he's pitching in Coors in general worries me. The fact he throws a curveball a lot doesn't do him any favors, but it's still basically that I'm just willing to take the discount that I'm getting against this god-awful Rockies team and assume that Urias can find a way to get them out.
Yeah, listen, the Rockies couldn't be worse, but it's Coors Field. We've seen them score a bunch of runs there. So some of the hitters, it doesn't really matter how bad they are, but certainly, like I said, CJ Cron's going to be my number one target here and the guy that I like the most. Obviously, Story also, except he's expensive on FanDuel and DraftKings, so it's just kind of a different situation. But relative to price and ownership, Cron, my number one overall favorite guy here and somebody who I really like as a one-off on this slate. Next game here, this is going to be the chalk at pitcher, at least as of now, the chalk at pitcher. Once again, something subject to changes as we get more information of a top pitcher tool. That is free today on Awesemo.com. But Andrew Heaney on the mound against the Seattle Mariners. So what do you make of Heaney? Underpriced, a whole lot of strikeout upside, but also super popular against Seattle.
This strikes me as a spot where I want a lot of Andrew Heaney, and in lineups that I don't have him, I want Seattle one-offs. Heaney strikes out a ton of guys, and he gives up a lot of power. Against righties this year, he has a 31.7% strikeout percentage, which is obviously elite for someone at 7,400. He's also allowed a 209 expected ISO. There is power in the Seattle lineup. Mitch Haniger at 4,100 has a really high ceiling here. Ty France at 3,200, I think, looks pretty good. The rest of the lineup kind of depends, how it ends up shaking out. You can certainly use Luis Torrens if he's batting fifth as a cheap catcher option. Seager hits lefties relatively well. But the point here being that Heaney's just mispriced. So I think his ownership's deserved. I think he's very capable at 7,400 of putting up a score that I don't want to say you have to have because it's really tough for a pitcher to put up a score that you have to have. But he's pretty likely to put up a score that definitely helps you in tournaments. But at the same time, he is getting a lot of ownership and the Mariners do have power. So in the lineups where I end up not having Heaney, I think it does make sense to at least, if it's I don't want to say to force in Mariners, but if you're in a situation where it's like, oh, I need a bat in this price range, do I want to go to Haniger or a different $4,100 guy, or do I want to go to Ty France or a different $3,300 guy to like kind of air towards the Mariners where you don't have Heaney? Because at his price, if he has the game that he is like expected to have or likely to have, he's going to put up a good score. So I think that if you're not playing him, it makes sense to be trying to get a home run or two against him.
Yeah, and in the last month and a half, Andrew Heaney has scored negative fantasy points on multiple occasions. He's also scored 26 plus fantasy points on multiple occasions. So really, really high upside guy, also pretty low floor, because the thing with Andrew Heaney is he's a fine big league starting pitcher. He's just not great. But for fantasy purposes, he's excellent just because of how high his strikeout rate is, 28.5% K rate. So for him to have any success, he's generating a bunch of swing and misses because he allows a bunch of hard contact. So people putting the ball in play against Heaney usually leads to a lot of success for them. But Heaney's numbers for the year, it's a 5.38 ERA, a 4.49 expected ERA. But it's just that strikeout rate where he's striking out nearly a third of the hitters he faces. It's it's another one of these spots, a whole lot of GPP upside. But given all the ownership going to Andrew Heaney and the fact that he isn't, a great starting pitcher, I do think it makes sense to get to Seattle as a contrarian stack today. Only 2.4% projected ownership. There's also a lot of leverage there. So no issue with that. Another spot where I think there's a lot of ownership, a lot of upside on both sides and a little bit of leverage play with in terms of the ownership here. On the mound for the Mariners, it is Chris Flexen going up against the Los Angeles Angels. I think the question here is just going to be how often do we want to spend up for Shohei Ohtani?
A lot. I mean, I don't think it'll be that tough since you can get so much upside at pitcher in the mid-range. Like in tournaments, I don't have a problem just kind of even foregoing the top of the pitchers. As much as I like Robbie Ray and, I like Awesemo and I like those guys, you're still getting plenty of upside if you go with, if you end up with something like Duffy plus Heaney or Urias plus Heaney or something like that. So I don't think it'll be that tough to get to expensive bats. Ohtani clearly in a good spot, one of the best hitters in baseball. Chris Flexen against lefties this year has done a pretty good job limiting power, only a 141 expected ISO, only a 16% strikeout percentage. And again, Ohtani's just one of those guys where if he's going to put the ball in play, typically it's going to be hit very, very hard and good things are going to happen.
Yeah, and just because I know this is going to be a narrative that people are going to bring up, so I think we should mention it here. Any concern from you with Shohei Ohtani, given that he was in the home run derby and that he looked pretty gassed? He had a fairly heavy workload over the course of last week, certainly compared to other players. Is that something weighing on your mind at all?
Not really. Like, would I rather he sat out the entire All-Star weekend? I guess, but it's not something that's going to get him out of my lineups.
Yeah, I mean, I still think he's the guy to pay up for on the slate as far as hitters go. Sub 10% projected ownership. And once again, also a guy who he legitimately might hit 70 home runs this year. Just if you look at what he did over the last month of play, he is the league leader in home runs. And while he isn't pacing for quite that many, he hit so many home runs over the last month. And he's somebody who seems to be continually getting better as a hitter. Now he has a WRC plus up to 180. And, earlier in the year, even when he was really successful at the plate from a power upside, he was striking out a lot. And then some of his other numbers were kind of, lagging. Now I'd just say that in reference to other elite hitters in the league, he was still a guy who had like a 150 WRC plus, but now Ohtani just looks like somebody who's, nearly impossible to get out at the plate. So all the power upside, I don't think there's anybody really more likely to hit a home run than him on the slate. So as a one-off, Ohtani certainly makes a whole lot of sense. Next game here, Chris Bassett and the Oakland A's, one of the bigger favorites on the slate, going up against Eli Morgan and the Cleveland Indians. So with Chris Bassett, we've talked about this before. I've been wrong on Bassett a lot this year. I keep waiting for him to regress, and it never really seems to happen. Bassett's having a very strong year, 3.28 ERA, 3.53 expected ERA. Still, though, he only has a 24.5% K rate. So it's not really that I'm digging my heels in on Chris Bassett and saying, I don't think this guy's any good. I don't want to play him. It's just I don't think he has the same strikeout upside as other guys who are in the same price range as him. He's still pretty popular with over 20% projected ownership. If I'm going to one of these more popular starting pitchers, I'd rather get to Charlie Morton, Andrew Heaney, Tyler Mahle, Robbie Ray, all guys in the same price range who just have considerably more strikeout upside.
Yeah, I think we're kind of on the same page. I buy into Bassett. He was someone that I thought in previous seasons should be better than his results, and then now we're seeing it. But It's just kind of an awkward price point on this slate because of not even anything to do with Bassett. I'm not even saying I think he's overpriced at 8,500 because I don't. But it's more so that I think he's less underpriced than a lot of other pitchers. Like you get, I think, a little bit more strikeout upside from somebody like Charlie Morton. You get a huge salary discount going to somebody like Heaney or Duffy or Urias. Heaney and Urias and Duffy all with higher strikeout percentages than Bassett this year. McCullers has a higher strikeout percentage and isn't that much more expensive. Molly has a higher strikeout percentage and is a little bit cheaper. And the Indians, while they're not a really scary offense, they're not one that I really love picking on either. So I guess it's a long way of saying, like, I like Bassett. I think he does well, but especially with where his ownership is at right now, it's not like you're getting a big ownership discount on him. I feel a little bit differently if by lock, a bunch of ownership has disappeared from Bassett and more of it's going to Morton, more of it's going to McCullers, more of it's going to Molly. And I can say, okay, like, cool, I'll take Chris Bassett and his 25% strikeout percentage at 10% ownership or something. But right now, it's just kind of like from a roster construction standpoint, I think I end up getting, more lineups where like I pay for Robbie Ray and then pay down for SP2 or where I just go to like a lower owned 8K or so guy. Like it's just right now it's kind of, I think, awkward pricing and awkward ownership on Bassett.
Yeah, and then on the other side, I'm going to have to gravitate to the Oakland A's a little bit because Eli Morgan might be the worst starting pitcher that we have on the slate today. And this says a lot because we've got, like Keegan Aiken on the mound for the Orioles, but Eli Morgan this year, 8.44 ERA, 6.08 expected ERA, 6.68 FIP. I really like the power upside the Oakland A's offense brings to the table, and Morgan just sucks so far this year. So give me the Oakland offense at low ownership.
Yeah, right there with you. Morgan is just someone that doesn't profile as a particularly good major league pitcher. He throws like 90 miles an hour. He has a very, very good changeup. And that's something that he just reminds me of somebody like if he had come up in like 1992, he probably would have success. But he's just not the kind of guy that has success in today's game. And he really hasn't so far. Limited sample, but 289 expected ISO to righties, 244 to lefties. Tons of power in this Oakland lineup. Matt Olson at 5,300, Chapman at 5K. Look pretty good, even though they're relatively expensive. But then you can look down. Jed Lowry at 3,800 gives you a pretty high upside second base option. Sean Murphy has power for a $3,900 catcher. Ramon Laureano, we know, has power and stolen base upside. $2,800 Seth Brown has power. Helped win me a GPP last Saturday, so had to mention him. But point being that there's just power top to bottom in this Oakland lineup. And even though the park isn't great, that's the one downside here is, the park is pretty tough to hit in. But I do think it's a good spot for Oakland. And right now, they're only getting about 2% ownership. So should be pretty low.
Yeah, and the final game on the slate, we have the Chicago Cubs in Arizona to take on the Arizona Diamondbacks. And Kyle Hendricks on the mound for the Cubs. He has had a pretty underwhelming season. The 3.77 ERA is not bad. It is the worst of his career since his first full season in the big leagues. But the underlying numbers, 4.93 expected ERA, that's a career worst. 4.83 FIP, that's a career worst. The strikeout rate, even by Kyle Hendricks standards, 18%. So we're looking at a career low strikeout rate. He's not generating swing and misses. I get that it's a favorable matchup against the Diamondbacks, and I have stacked against Hendricks a good deal this year. I don't think this is a spot where I'm going to be stacking against him, though, just because I think the Diamondbacks offense is so weak, and I am looking for some spots to cut out. So no interest in Hendricks for me, but at the same time, no real interest in the Diamondbacks. How do you feel about that, Adam?
Mostly the same. I don't really see a reason to go to Hendricks here. There's enough strikeout upside at his price point that I don't really need to mess with him. I'm not really looking to stack the Diamondbacks either. I will say if $2,000 Cole Calhoun's in the lineup, I think that's a very good spot to get to. Christian Walker at 2,700 offers some upside as well. But Calhoun's really the one that stands out because we know Calhoun has some power from the left side. Hendricks has allowed a 208 expected ISO to lefties this year. It's just a mispricing if Cole Calhoun's hitting in the middle of this order.
Yeah, and then on the other side, Madison Bumgarner starting on the mound for the Arizona Diamondbacks. And Bumgarner really could not be too much more washed up at this point in his career. The one thing I will say here about the Chicago Cubs, this looks like a team that's going to be selling at the trade deadline. We already saw this start to take into action yesterday where they traded Jock Peterson to the Braves, but still Madison Bumgarner's numbers for the year, 5.73 ERA, 4.47 FIP. Definitely seems to be somebody on the decline. He has had, slightly better results this year than last year, but also coming off the injured list, Madison Bumgarner, when's the last time that he was on the mound? It's been a while now. Bumgarner's last start came
June 2nd.
Yeah, June 2nd. So we're looking at over a month. For Bumgarner, certainly no reason to roster him, but On the other side, how much interest in a Cubs team that looks like they're going to kind of be sellers at the trade deadline? And then also, Bumgarner well rested, having not started in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I like the spot for Chicago. I like the pricing on Chicago. Right now, they're projected to get a little bit more ownership than they should based on the top stack tool. But you have a lot of right-handed power in this lineup, and it's just not expensive. I mean, Chris Bryant, 4,300 on DK. Javi Baez, 4,500. Wilson Contreras, 4,500. Those are all very, very reasonable salaries. Anthony Rizzo, we know, can hit anybody. He's only 4,200. So if the ownership comes down a little bit, I like getting to the Cubs. Even where it's at, I like using those guys as one-off because Bumgarner is a pitcher that I've thought was washed for a while. And now you're getting him out of San Francisco. He's still in a favorable pitcher's park. I was disappointed if he didn't go somewhere else and just completely get destroyed this year. But he's still allowed a 217 ISO to righties this year. And I think it sets up pretty nicely for the bats in the middle of the order for the Cubs.
All right, guys, that is going to do it for the strategy show, but there's a lot more baseball content coming up today. We've got the MLB Deeper Dive later today, MLB Live before lock. So be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already done that, so you know when those shows go live. Also, like the video, support Adam and I, because that helps out the channel a whole bunch. And then also the MLB Top Pitchers tool that is going to be free today at Awesemo.com. Going to be very important information to keep an eye on during the day, because while Adam and I were doing the show, we only knew the starting pitchers, for about half of the games today. So as more of those pitchers get confirmed, that data is going to be updated. So keep an eye on that. Also, thank you to PrizePicks for sponsoring the show. If you guys are new to the site, head on over to PrizePicks.com and use the promo code Awesemo for a $100 bonus on your first deposit. That'll do it. That'll do it for Adam and I today. Also, thanks to Tyler behind the glass, and play the music out.